Hello. Today we are going to have our last one stream in Codebreak Club community together with engineering community of UK. So today we are going to talk about test-driven development, and our speaker today, Alexander Barmin. So, Alexander, please go on.
Hello, Andrei. Thank you very much for organizing this fantastic set of events. I'm really happy to be here. I'm really happy to contribute to the Codebreak Club. And my dear participants, I'm really happy you joined my session today. Yes, as Andrei mentioned, today we are going to talk about test-driven development and, well, mostly we will talk about Spring Boot. Well, I hope I can see your comments at least somewhere. If not, do not hesitate to put your comments, questions onto the chat, and they will help me and share them with me. Let's start. Let's start bit by bit. Before we start, as ordinary, I'd like to tell a few words about myself. My name is Alexander Barmin, and I'm Chief Software Engineer Level 1 at CPAM United Kingdom. Up to this moment, I've been to software development for more than 10 years. I have a couple of degrees. I have a few certificates from cloud vendors. And if you'd like to follow me on Twitter and follow me on GitHub. Let's do not waste time. Today we have a quite long session. It will take 2 hours. Please let me know if you need a break somewhere in the middle. We will do that. And in order not to waste time, let's dive deeper into the test-driven development. Well, I suppose test-driven development is not a new topic. And every time we speak about tests, we say that, well, tests are important. They make our software better. They allow us to rewrite and write cleaner code and save some efforts and so on. And actually, that's true. Maintenance costs are reduced by using test-driven development. The problem is that it's really hard to start writing tests, and it's really hard to catch that vibe when you're confident in changes you're doing, because every line of code is tested. Well, by the way, what do you ordinarily see when you start learning TDD? Well, you ordinarily see something like this. You have a fantastic class like my class with a super stupid method like sum, and here you're writing a fantastic and by its simplicity and uselessness test. Like the test you can see on the right hand side, you're fantastically checking that summarization is working as expected, right? Now your function is tested, it is stable, and it works as expected every time. Well, of course, now you can say, right after my slide 4, you can say that you're familiar with test-driven development, and if you're asked on the interview, what do you know about it? You may say, I'm expert in it, because you're already familiar with the procedure. Nevertheless, it is not too simple to use TDD in real life. The problem is it's hard to move from this simple study example to a real-life application of TDD. Real-life applications are much more complicated. This is something like real-life application. As you may see, it is in the middle, and on what we have on the left-hand side is dependencies. When our ordinary application requires many third parties like message queues, databases, file storages, and also on the right-hand side we can have third-party dependencies. Like if we have an application which requires some authentication, we can have OAuth service and so on. And the problem is, in order to start writing tests for such kind of application, you need to establish all this infrastructure, and more likely you have to do it on your own. You need to install all the software on your computer, and well, in order to run one single application, which is here in the middle, you may need to install all these third parties. That's why, well, you may say, I have tested everything on my computer, it works. And that's why there is no reason for me to write these tests. Well, Or maybe you can say you have a bit different example. For example, you need to use database in your application, and before running tests, you need to add some data into the database and execute some storage procedures. Well, of course, it's much easier to do it once, and it's much easier to do it manually on your own. But will you be able to do it regularly? For example, you change 20 lines of code, and again, you'd like to load data into your database and run some tests manually. Well, you may say it's not. It can be. It's not a real life example because our applications nowadays are small microservices, and it's really easy to check if every of them works locally. But what about testing all of them in conjunction? For example, you have a big set of microservices and you'd like to test that service A can talk to service B, B talks to C, and so on. It's challenging, I assume. As many manual steps you need to undertake in order to run tests, then less likely you will finally do it. Well, there is another interesting delusion when we speak about test-driven development. And it is that we have to write tests for the code we haven't written yet, right? Right. Think about it. How can you test the code you have not written yet? Of course, you can't. And that's why it's important to change your mind at least a little and think about tests not as tests which check your code, but about your specifications, like real specification in code of your code. It's a very simple example, by the way. It's really easy to change the mind here. Instead of saying, given a record exists in a database and when an endpoint is accessed, then the record is returned. Have you ever heard it? I think so, given then is a quite common way of writing tests and quite common way of writing specification. But we can change it and ask different questions against our code. What should happen if the endpoint is accessed? Do you see the difference? I think yes, because in first case, when we're writing just given them then, we're just saying, well, something should happen. But in a opposite case, when we're saying what will happen, when we're asking a good question, what will happen when endpoint is accessed, we're asking a different question. Well, by the way, this is actually a good way and a way we think we need to write the code. What should happen if a particular endpoint is accessed, and what should happen if the record is not in database, and so on. So this way of thinking allows us to change our mind from writing tests to writing specifications. Okay, so, and anyway, even if I have not convinced you yet, you may say, well, why should I still write tests? Because it takes 2 times longer to write it. And on the other hand, we have QA team who can test our code before going live, before going to production. And actually, that's true. Nevertheless, yes, actually that's true. And on the right-hand side of the slide, you may see that actually we can write code, and after that we will get feedback from our QA team. Next, we will fix our code again, and we again will pass this code to the QA team, and finally it's approved and delivered to production, right? Right. But have you ever have you ever thought about the moment that actually this cycle, write code, deploy it, give to QA, takes time? For example, if you're making releases once a week, you will get a feedback regarding your code only in a week, right? That's why one of the first and one of the most important reasons to write tests is to get a feedback quicker. And also, as quicker we get in a feedback, the more reliable software we're delivering. And again, you may say, my business is pushing me to deliver features quickly because that's why I'm not writing tests. That's why I'm just delivering feature, and instead of thinking about well, this all this procedure, instead of writing useless code which is not executed in production, I will just deliver the features, right? Yes, but no. The goal of your again, the main goal of software development is not just write features, because as you may see on the left-hand side, it takes 4 boxes to deliver the feature. We use a traditional approach when you do not write tests. But what if you write tests, for example, on like right column on the right-hand side, when you write code and spend some time on writing a few more lines of code, for example, test code. And here you may get a quicker feedback, and that's why actually by delivering the feature using test-driven approach, you're delivering it quicker. As you may see on the right-hand side, your line is 1 box shorter. So you may still have to consider writing your code and writing your tests first. Another important reason to write tests is that it allows you to think about your architecture, because, if you have a big piece of software, if you have a big, let's say, application, you have to split into the pieces in order to test it regularly, right? And that's why you have to think about responsibilities and dependencies. You have to use a version of control, which makes the code cleaner and more readable and stable. Even if you have tests, you can safely refactor the code. Our code is not always perfect. Sometimes we have legacy code, and we can have a code which is written in rush. Of course, you may be said, come on, you're professional. Please write code correctly from the very first time, right? I think you can, for example, type a plus into the chat if you've ever been asked to write the correct code from the very first time. But at the same time, you may know that it is not always possible. For example, requirements may change, you may change your mind. For example, you may face a situation when one feature contradicts with another feature. That's why you have to resolve conflicts and so on. And tests allows you to refactor your code without having a fear. I have even heard a quite good sentence regarding tests and refactoring without tests. Maybe we have to cut this phrase off at a later point from the recording, but let me say it. Refactoring without test is just rolling shit around. Because without tests, you cannot safely refactor your code. And the main outcome of tests is that they create a good basement, which allows you to deliver code with constant speed. Let's move on and talk a little about the main point, why it is necessary and why it is important to write tests first. Of course, if you have a build pipeline which checks if your code is covered with tests, you may face a situation when your pipeline is not green until you write some tests and until you reach certain amount of certain code coverage. Please put 25 into the chat if you have ever faced situation like this. And of course, you may say that, well, I do not have such kind of procedure in my pipeline. Nevertheless, I have a point in definition of done, which says test should be written as must, and my PR will not be accepted without tests. That's why you have to write your code first, and next, only after that, you should write your tests. But the main point is that how will you prove that your tests are working correctly? Maybe in this case, you have to comment a piece of code. You need to break your code in order to make sure that your tests are still working. And that's why maybe I would say that why should you do that? Why are you doing that? Maybe it's better to write tests first instead of breaking your code. And again, tests are quite good decomposition and architecture tools. That's why by developing we can develop big piece of software only by splitting it into the bits. Like we can eat an elephant only by slicing it in pieces. And tests are gracefully helping us here. Well, as for me, test-driven development is not only about red-green refactoring cycle. It's more about way of thinking, because it's a great tool which allows you to split big tasks into small subtasks. It allows to structure your code and your component, and it gracefully helps you to establish boundaries in your components. And of course, it makes refactoring much easier. I need also to say a few words regarding acceptance tests. Because if you have ever heard about acceptance tests, you may say that, well, these tests are ordinarily written by QA team, these tests are executed on the later stage, they are ordinarily written using BDD and Gherkin, they are slow, expensive, and test my application as a black box. Again, acceptance tests are very useful, but they test our software only at the end of the development. And the problem is long feedback. Nevertheless, acceptance tests are very important, and there is one rule of thumb which allows you to check whether acceptance tests are useful. It's very simple. If it's possible to use acceptance tests as smoke tests at the very end, acceptance tests are useful. And what else I want to say is a few words about code coverage or test coverage. Well, is it important to have 100 or 95% or 80% or 50% of code covered by tests? Is it good to have 100% of code coverage, or 85% is enough? I don't know. But the main rule of thumb is reliability of tests. If you see that your tests are green, can you rely on them? For example, if your pipeline says that everything is green, will you go to production? If yes, it means that your code coverage is sufficient. If no, I think you're wasting time on writing tests. Before moving forward, by the way, do we have any questions in the chat? Is there anybody there?
Not yet, but we are ready to answer. Feel free to write some questions. I have one question regarding tests. How to check that I write the test in right way?
Well, I suppose it's a very good question, and to be honest, there are a few good practices. Of course, there are a few formal practices, which says the way you should structure your test. For example, there are a few acronyms. I like acronyms. First acronym is AAA. You should structure your test in a way when you arrange it first, next act, and third you assert. This is the first useful acronym for, and it may be used as a rule of thumb. It means that you're structuring your test in a proper way. Also, there is another acronym, which is FIRST, which allows you to write tests, which is also a good rule of thumb for writing tests. Your test should be fast. It means that your test should be executed, let's say, quickly. I'm not saying that your test should be executed within 1 minute, within 5 seconds, within 3 seconds, and so on. I'm saying that it should be quick enough in order you not to skip it. I in first is independency. Your test should be independent. It means that result of one test should not depend on results of another test. It means that, well, I have seen examples when one test prepares some test data for another test. It is not correct. That's why tests are not independent anymore. R, tests should be repeatable. It means that they should give the same results by running them 20 times in a row, for example. Of course, they should be as self-checked. It means self-checking or self-interpretable. It means that you should not pay additional attention to understand whether the test is failed or successful. It means that at the very end, you should not output anything to the console or to the log. You should clearly say if this condition is not achieved, the test is failed. So it literally means please add assertions at the end of your test. And the last one bit is T. It's timely. It would be nice to write tests at least 5 minutes ahead of your code. Nevertheless, even knowing all these acronyms and applying all practices from them doesn't allow you to write a good test from the very first time. That's why I suppose the very good way of writing good tests is to have practice. If you're the first person in your team who writing tests, it also can be possible. Just start writing tests. If you see that you already have some tests in your project, please take a look into them. If you have more mature people in your team or senior people in your team, you may ask them how to write tests in a proper way. That's why, Andrei, I do not have a clear answer. Let's say use 1, 2, 3 to write a good test. It's always debatable what to consider as a good test. And nevertheless, as I said, there are a few good practices how to do that. AAA and first. Hope I answered your question.
Yes, thank you. And I have one more question. If I have a really big legacy project without tests, should I start with covering existing logic, implemented logic, or should I write new logic with test?
Okay, that's a very good question. Thank you for it. So, let me. So the first of all, answer is no. You shouldn't write test for your existing legacy code, but as ordinary, yes. But you as soon as you write new code in your application, you write in test for your new code, of course. But nevertheless, if you're changing something in your existing legacy code, don't forget to write tests for it. So it means that you're establishing a boundary. This code is tested. On the left-hand side, for example, I wrote a new piece of code or I changed something in the existing code base, and it is good and tested. On the right-hand side, what I have is something unknown. It is legacy code. I'm not touching it. Nevertheless, it's quite important to establish this boundary. There are many ways how you can do that. On approach, let's say first simple approach, you're just writing test for new code. And second approach, you're writing, let's say, a boundary test, which says, for this input, I should have this output and nothing else. And this is the way of testing your existing legacy black box. You're just checking input and output without, let's say, establishing some mocks and without establishing, let's say, some additional configuration. You're just testing it as is. And again, it may depend on your exact situation, but this is a common approach.
Thank you. So we are waiting for questions in our chat on YouTube, and I'm going to go to Shadow.
Okay,
thank you for
good.
answers.
Thank you very much, Andrei. And I see comments here on StreamYard. And hello. Yes, hello. I see your comments. Well, I spent 20 minutes on just talking on different topics regarding tests. I hope I managed to convince you to start writing tests, and if you have never did it, and I think I managed to convince you to continue writing tests if you're already doing that. Fancy practice. Before moving forward, let me briefly explain or briefly show you the application I'm going to write. Of course, I do not have a lot of time, maybe 1 hour, 1 hour and a half. That's why I will write. I have already prepared a lot of, let's say, I have already prepared a lot of code for you to show. And first of all, the application I'm going to write and extend today is already on my GitHub. So it is here. Let me put the link to it into the chat. So Andrei, please help me and put in this link somewhere on YouTube. Maybe someone would like to do it together with me. Or even if not, it's absolutely fine. So let's take a look into the project. So this is a quite simple project, and it has a few branches. So first branch is main, and for the main branch, I already have everything written. It is test, it is code, and it is, as you may see, application which is managed by Maven. So Maven Clean Verify will do everything for you. If you'd like to practice today together with me, you can switch to another branch without tests, and there is a there is another branch without tests, and in this branch there is the same application, but not all bits and pieces of it are written, and tests are not here yet. So we will work on this branch today. And if you want, you can do it together with me. Well, that's all regarding the application, I assume. We will take a look into it quite shortly. So let's take a look into the functional requirements for the application. As you know, we have functional and non-functional requirements, and by the way, we are not talking about non-functional requirements today. Unfortunately, we will mostly talk about functional requirements. What my application is about? My application is about creation of accounts in bank. For example, you come to the bank branch and you'd like to get a credit or debit card. And at that moment, what you need to do, you need to apply as an applicant. And at this moment, you're applicant, you're not customer yet. And in bank, there is a couple of situations when you're new to bank and you're known to bank. And in case if you're new to bank, my application, which is responsible for collecting this data, should accept your email and last name, create an account for you, and return ID of created account. This is happy pass. In case of unhappy pass, if, for example, your email is known to bank and you're trying to provide it again, you should get a 409 error response. And for example, in case if you're trying to get information about known to bank account by email, you're receiving information about your account, and in case if you're not known to bank, application should return 404 response code. Everything is ordinary, very simple to the application we write on a daily basis. This is on the very high level the architecture of application I'd like to write. As you may see, it is going to be on the very high level layered application with 3 layers: a presentation layer, service layer, and data access layer. For the presentation layer, I'm going to use REST because it is simple, and this is something which we are ordinarily dealing with. For service layer, we will use something. We will write this code. Data access layer will be provided for me by Spring Data, and of course, we have to test everything. Let's take a look into the application, because why not? So I'm not going to write all the code from scratch, and some code is already available. So what I'm going to start is end-to-end test for my application, that acceptance tests, which I told about previously. If you take a look into these requirements, you may notice that these requirements are written in the Gherkin language, and these requirements are written in a very good fashion. Let's say it says, given something, for example, in this case, I'm arranging some data for my test. Next, there is an act bit of my specification which says when something is happening, for example, applicant provides an email and tries to get information about account by email. And this is a third part which says something should happen. This way of writing specification is quite convenient because we can easily convert it to acceptance test from the very beginning. For example, as you may see, these are scenarios written using Gherkin language. What is Gherkin? Gherkin is just a language which allows me to, let's say, specify requirements for my software this way. I'm going to write my application in Java using Java, and I'm going to test my application using Java. And unfortunately, Java cannot interpret English by heart without, let's say, additional modules. That's why in order to proceed, I'm adding a few dependencies to my test module. As you may see, I have two modules here in my Maven project. It is E2E with acceptance tests and app with application. For my test purposes, I'm adding a Cucumber to my project. Cucumber allows me to execute tests written in Gherkin language. So this is the first bit. In order to execute these tests, what I need to have? In order to execute them, I am going to use JUnit 5. And in order to make it running with JUnit 5, I need to put a few annotations on top of my test class. I'm putting suit testable and include engines. So suit and testable makes my test class executable, because without it, it will not be executable, because actually it doesn't have any tests inside, right? Right. But when I put that put testable annotation on top of it, it became executable. Include engines says that actually I have to use Cucumber for executing my test. So as you may see again, I have nothing in my test and to be executed. It means that actually JUnit cannot read my specification written in Gherkin. That's why I am adding Cucumber here. And also, it would be nice not to write tests using plain Java. If I'm writing my software using Spring, why can't I write tests using Spring as well? That's why here I'm saying that actually, Cucumber, when you will execute my tests, please also take a look into these two packages and see, maybe you will find something like a glue code inside them. What can be considered as a glue code? First thing is step definition. Step definition is quite interesting thing, which allows to connect this piece of text, for example, when an applicant provides some test email, this bit of code to be executed. For example, here I have a simple Java code with annotations like given, then, end on top of it. And as you may see here, I have regular expressions. In order to use them, do not forget to put these symbols at the beginning and at the end of your, let's say, phrase, and it allows you to extract some pieces of text from your expression. So what will happen at the end? At the end of the day, when Cucumber will read this specification from top to the bottom, it will execute pieces of code from this step definition file. For example, if I have something like an applicant with email is new to bank, this bit of code will be executed. Next, an applicant with email is known to bank, this piece of code will be executed. Quite convenient, useful, and so on. Nevertheless, it's really hard to write good tests without without sharing some state or without having some services here, testing services. And here we can, of course, use Spring. And in order to use Spring, we can, and Spring brings us a quite interesting benefit. It allows us to inject components, our test components, into our Cucumber tests. In order to do that, we need to have a class which is annotated with Cucumber context configuration. This Cucumber context configuration actually is quite simple class, which allows, says that, well, inside this class, I'm putting something which allows me to configure test context for my test application. Unfortunately, on top of this class, I cannot put another annotation configuration. That's why here I'm creating inside my Cucumber context configuration class, I'm creating another internal class, and here I'm providing well-known Spring annotations like configuration and component scan, which allows me to have a service inside. And service here for my testing purposes is actually let's say it is a wrapper around REST template which communicates, which talks to my real application. Well, let's run the test. What I have at the moment? At the moment, I have only my specifications, and I do not have application. As you may see, all of my tests failed, right? If I scroll down, I will see that, oh my God, it is not working because my application is not running. because actually, yes, my application is not running. It is expected to be started on port 8080. And if I go to my app project, what I will have here, I will have just a few classes. It is, first of all, my workshop application, which is an ordinary Spring Boot application, and a data model. In order to write code for data model, I created it from, I copied it from real project. I copied it from real project and I will use it. Even if I run my application, my tests will not pass. The true reason is that, unfortunately, not all the features of my application are implemented yet. And this is what we're going to do today. So, as you may see, something is working, and at least one test passes, but this test checks 404. Let's start writing code and let's start writing tests. Let's get back to the specification, to the first one, and let's start thinking. By the way, if you have any questions, do not hesitate to put them into the chat, and I'm happy to answer all your questions. Let's write. So what I want to do, what I want to write today, I'm going to start with the happy path, and what I can see here. I need to create an applicant, and when the applicant is successfully created, application should return ID of a created record. Well, if I again get back to my slides and see, for example, and take a look into the architecture of my application, I may notice that on top of everything, I have a presentation layer, which is expected to be a REST controller. And this is what I'm going to start with. As ordinary, I'm starting and creating a package. Let's call it controller. And let's call this controller applicant controller. And in order to reindent the wheel, as ordinary, I will put REST controller annotation on top of it. And what else I'm going to put is request mapping annotation, applicants. I suppose this is enough. This is enough to start writing my test. What can I do to test my controller? Well, on the one hand, what I can do is to create the controller manually. For example, something like this: applicant controller, controller new applicant controller. It is not a Spring way of doing that. On the one hand. On the other hand, it doesn't allow me to test my application in a way when it receives a real REST call. Instead, I'd like to use a testing layer provided by Spring, and what I'm going to do is to put web MVC test on top of my test. As you may see, there are a couple of options. I can put web MVC, I can put web flux test, and web MVC is useful when you're using Spring MVC, and I'm using Spring MVC. Web flux test is useful when you're using Spring Web Flux and reactive stack. There is slight difference. Let's say there is a small difference. In case if you're using a reactive stack, you're expected to use web test client. When you're using web MVC test, you're expected to use mock MVC. That's why the first thing I'm doing is injecting mock MVC into my test. Let's check. Let's write a very simple test using JUnit 5, of course, which check if my context starts. Let's say that mock MVC import static methods is not null. Why this test is important? Because it allows me to check that my test is actually green by default. And next I will start extending it. Well, nevertheless, despite the fact that you noticed that when my test started to execute, it initialized a lot of components, even if my application is big enough, and as you may see, it is Spring Boot test, but at the end of the day, even if my application is super complicated, it has many levels of, and many layers. Not all the components will be included into my application context by default. How is it achieved? If you take a look into web MVC test annotation, we will notice that actually it is a meta annotation with many annotations on top of it. As you may see 20 of annotations on top. And what's important for us is this one. Despite configuring cache, web MVC, and mock MVC for us, web MVC test annotation also scans class paths and include only classes which are annotated by a particular annotation. Not all the classes are included. What will be included by default? It will include all web MVC configurer, and we ordinarily use them for configuring, for example, security. It will include controller devices, which are widely used for exception handling, JSON components, which are widely used for JSON mapping, and classes annotated with controller and REST controller annotations. So what I want to say is that do not be afraid. Not all the classes from your application context will be included into this test. And here we're finally in the position to start writing the test. What kind of test we're going to write? We're going to write this happy path test. Applicant is new to bank, and when email and valid last name is provided, happy path, okay, create applicant happy path. It would be a good name for a test, but nevertheless, it is not a very good name for the test, because on left-hand side, which is create applicant, is useful. It says that what exact method we're testing, but right-hand side of that method is not so useful. That's why let's try to name it a bit differently. When valid email and last name are provided, then return ID. So as you can see right now, name of the test method is quite long and not readable. That's why we can use display name for making it a bit more readable. When a valid email and last name are provided, then ID of created record should be returned. Here we can write anything because it's just a string and it is used only for JUnit. This method will throw exception by default, and I want to do a small preparation. I'm going to import static mock MVC request builders, and I'm going to import static mock MVC response launchers and mock MVC response handlers. This will make my this actually allows me to use quite interesting DSL of Spring mock MVC, which makes my tests much easier. So what I'm going to write is I want to ask I see your question. I will answer it. What I'm going to write is I'm going to simulate a behavior when a request is sent to a particular endpoint. And in order to do it, I will not access my controller directly. What I'm going to do is I'm going to post somewhere something. And here I'm going to expect something. So this bit allows me to configure the request to be sent. So I'm sending it with content type, because I'm going to send a JSON, media type application JSON. And of course, there should be some content in my body. I will write it a little later. And what I'm going to expect is I'm going to expect a status of created. And what else I'm going to expect? I'm going to expect a header with some value. Header string, HTTP headers, location like applicant 123. At least that's for now. And I see the question from Jaggers, I hope I pronounce your name correctly, is about mixing camel case and snake case in tests. Well, you may see different approach for naming tests. Thank you very much for your question, first of all. And this Actually, we're not intentionally mixing camel case and snake case here. Underscore here is used to separate what exact method we're going to test and what results we're going to achieve. It's not mandatory, it is just a good way of separating, just a good way of structuring name of your test method. Of course, you may write it in this way. Create applicant, when valid email and something is provided, then something is returned. It's also good. I remember I noticed this way of writing tests in, I don't remember what was the name of the book I found it. It was something like a clean coder or maybe uh, um, uh, something about architecture, and I liked it. So I use this approach because, as for me, it is really clear and it is really descriptive because it's, as I said, it allows to understand what exactly I'm testing and what is the expected output. Nevertheless, I'm not saying that it is mandatory. Please, first of all, consider code standards from your team, because if you already have a established constant code the standard in your project, maybe it's better not to violate it. If you're writing tests from the very beginning, maybe you may consider using this approach because it is quite clear and allows to see what exactly you're testing and what is the expected output. Hope I answered your question. And what we did, we send the request and of course get a not valid response, right? This is what we get. For example, we expected status to be 401 created and we got 404 because there is nothing. Okay, let's move forward. Let's move forward and write some code. We know why it happened, because in our applicant controller we have not written any code yet, right? Right. So let's write some code. You have already seen that I'm sending a post request, and as for now, it is expected to return status 401, and it is expected to return something. Create applicant. Let's write a very simple. Let's write a very simple approach. Let's say, let's write a very simple bit of code which allows my test to pass. Let's start with a simple thing, with the first thing. I even like to get rid of, let's say, one line of test from my test in order to go in very small steps. And I see a very good question from Artyom. How did I follow AAA in this test? So it's very good. So this bit is a range, because here I'm preparing a request I'm going to send. This bit a mock MVC perform is act, and here at the end is a third bit. So everything is here. Getting back to my code, in order to fix this simple bit, simple test and to make it passing, the one single thing I need to do is to say response status, HTTP status created. So it will work. But why will it work? Just because we have written only very simple and stupid bit of code. Let me return next bit of code, which allows me to return a header here. And unsurprisingly, my test will fail. That's why I need to write some code here as well. For example, here I'm going to return some response entity. Why I'm returning response entity? Because in my response entity, I can add a URI for location header, applicants 1 to 3 builds. So it will not work because I need to say I'm throwing an exception. Throw exception. What went wrong? New URL and new URI, of course. New URI, yeah, it works. So test will pass, and everything seems to be okay, right? Right. Nevertheless, if I get back to my code, what I will notice that actually into my specification, I will notice that actually I have not provided email and I have not provided a valid last name. And I have not yet implemented this bit when my applicant is new to ban. I'm just assuming it, at least for now. And on the other hand, it's not responsibility of service of controller to check whether applicant is new to bank or not. That's why it means that actually I should have another service which will be responsible, another component which will be responsible for checking it. It means that I will have a service in my code. Well, let's move forward and let's add that bit about service into my code. What I'm going to do, I'm going to add it into my test first. But as you may notice, I haven't started writing services yet. What I'm going to do, I'm going to create a package with name service, and I'm going to, let's say, create an applicant service first. Applicant service. I will put a notation service on top of it, and I assume that's enough. I will not use the service in my test directly. Instead of it, I will use mock of my service. I haven't written it yet, but I know how it should work. I'm injecting my applicant service here. And what is the magic annotation mock bin? You know, we have a fantastic mocking framework, which is Mockita, and we can use it in Spring tests as well. What does it mean here? It says that Spring, when you will initialize a Spring application context, please, instead of a real bin of type applicant service, please create a bin which is actually a Mockita, which is actually being extended by Mockita, which is a component extended by Mockita. So instead of having a real applicant service in application context for my test, I will have another bin which is created using mocking framework. So what I'm going to test, and how should I write a test which will fail for my exact situation? As you may see here, I have a happy pass. That's why it looks like my test should work in the following way. I should, at the end of the day, verify that my applicant service was accessed at least once. That's why I'm using Mockita verify and Mockita times, and it should have a method of with name safe. This method with name safe should be accessed at least once, and any applicant, which is my domain class, should be passed to this method. As you may see, again, my test is red, and why it is red? Because I'm adding a level of abstraction onto my code. I'm adding a service, and right now the service has not been written yet. I know what it should do, but I have not implemented it yet. Right? This is my applicant, and instead of writing it right now, I'm using mocking framework. And that's why this is not a real service. It will be something like a mock. So as you may see, my code is not working because actually it was expected to have one single interaction with this mock, but there were no interactions with it. Well, let's fix it. So I'm going to my test my controller and writing request body annotation. I'm putting applicant as a request type, and I'm injecting after wiring my applicant service here. My applicant service created for test, which is actually a mock, will be used here as well. That's why I'm quite, let's say, it's quite safe to use it here. So there will be one interaction with it. I assume there will be one interaction with it, but no, there are no interactions with it because I'm getting 400, and the reason is because actually what I sent to my controller is just an empty string. Well, and here I would say one quite important thing. Unfortunately, web mock MVC has some limitations. It cannot convert our request to JSON under the hood. If we're using a web test client, it can convert our let's say domain object to JSON and next send them to endpoint as a JSON. For mock MVC, we have to do it on our own. But what is convenient is, as I said, Web MVC includes a lot of components into application context, and one of that component is object mapper, which is the JSON mapper provided by Jackson. So it means that we actually can use it write as value as string. We can use object mapper to convert our object to JSON. So let's create a valid applicant, because in my test I'm using a valid applicant. Person, as you may see, there is a quite big domain model because it is taken from a real project. This is last name, and this is contact point, electronic address, and this is my email, test@test.com. Now it will start to work. Oh no, it will not, because I haven't sent anything yet. This is my JSON body. And I'm sending my JSON body. Fortunately, I forget to send it. Right? Works. But how can I be sure that the JSON body I sent to my controller is actually the same JSON body I received in my service? And here again, what we can use another interesting thing, which is Captor. Captor is a part of Makita, which allows to capture values passed to mocks. In order to use Captor, I can create it manually using just inside the method. This is the first option. I will also show another option. Argument Captor of type applicant. This is applicant Captor. This is the way I can create Captor on class level, and also I can create Captor argument Captor for class applicant.class. I can create it here inside applicant Captor, inside my method. How will I use it? Instead of saying here that my applicant service is accessed at least one with any applicant, instead of that, I'm saying I will use applicant argument Captor to capture my argument, to capture a real value which was passed to this mock. What I'm going to do next, applicant argument capture, I'm retrieving a value from it. This is captured value. So this is a quite good way when I need to check what exact value was sent to a particular mock. What next I need to do? It would be nice to check that value which I sent here to in my JSON body is actually the same as applicant I received in my service. If you take a look into my applicant, you will see that actually there are many annotations on top of it. The majority of these annotations are provided by Lombok, and nevertheless, this domain model is relatively big. It has a lot of branches. It would be nice to have a good way of checking the object recursively, right? Right. As you may have already noticed, I'm using quite strange way of asserting. And this is a assert.j library, and this assert.j library is automatically bring when you use Spring test. And it has many features, by the way, under the hood, because first of all, it allows you to compare objects recursively. Let me briefly refactor my code. JSON JSON object matter. Let me briefly refactor my code. This is my original applicant. I'm converting to JSON and sending. Again, this is a bit of a range. This is act and this bit is assert. And using assert.j library, I can do the following. I can assert that captured value using recursive comparison is equal to original applicant. So instead of, let's say, comparing fields like last name, email, and so on, I can say that please, SRJ, please compare my object and go deeper. Right? Right. Well, that's really good. We fixed a lot of code, but nevertheless, I'm quite concerned in this 1, 2, 3, right? Because actually it should be an identifier of my object. And it would be nice this identifier to be generated by something. And ordinarily, this identifier should be generated by our persistent layer, for example, by our database. But I haven't reached the point when I'm writing coding for my database yet. That's why I have to simulate this behavior when this identifier is generated, right? And in order to do it, what I'm going to do, I'm again gonna use Makita features. And here I will configure my applicant service, save method. My save method should receive a particular argument of a particular, it should receive an original applicant. And when this method save is invoked, instead of standard way of using Makita when we're using then return, I'm gonna show you a bit different way of using it. We can use then answer. As you may see, my code is not, let's say, is not working now because it is expected that when we're using then answer or then return, our method returns something. And in this case, it should return applicant, it should return saved applicant, but for now, I do not want to implement this method. So what it allows me to, when answer allows me to do? When answer allows me to capture argument passed to my mock. Do you see the difference? In this case, we're saying that this configuration of mock will work only in case if we're sending applicant like this to it. But in this case, we're saying that this mock will work when we're for every this verification will work for every interaction with this mock, and we're capturing the argument. Okay, for simplicity, I will put any here, any applicant.class, but when I'm using then answer, I have access to the parameters which were really passed to that method. For example, what I can do, I can get argument on a position 0, and I know that first argument is type of applicant. Argument. This is my argument, and what I'm going to do with it, I'm going to assign applicant ID. Let it be 10. Right? Right. Or, for example, let it be generated automatically, but doesn't matter. For example, final long applicant ID, this will be 10. This is my applicant ID, and what is expected? It is expected that the same applicant ID will be here. So my test will fail now. And you see why, right? I hope you're still following me. It failed because response header location is not something which is expected. Let's fix it. And the way we are fixing it is this. So it is saved applicant, and here we're adding saved applicant, get applicant ID. Is it working? It should work. Let's check. Oops, something went wrong. As you may see, well, now what happened now is that if we get back to the test, we will see that actually this assertion fails because it tries to compare applicant we received in the save method and applicant we received in the request body, and they are different obviously, because here we already have in the save method, we already have at the result, we have an ID. That's why we need to exclude this ID from comparison. In order to exclude this field from comparison, we can say ignoring fields, applicant ID. We can ignore multiple fields using, for example, it is comma-separated list by passing multiple parameters. And if we'd like to, for example, make our comparison, recursive comparison, more complicated, we can exclude all the fields, for example, of a particular type. We can exclude, we can ignore all the long fields, for example. And hope you enjoyed the way we're writing code. If you have any questions, do not hesitate to put them into the chat. So what do we have at the end of the day? At the end of the day, we've written a quite simple piece of code, which checks this simple, let's say, this simple scenario. Let's, we have already implemented almost everything. Applicant with email is provided, ID is returned, and valid last name. We haven't tested it yet. What is the valid last name? What can we use in Spring in order to check whether our last name is valid or not? Of course, the best way of validation is obviously the best. Maybe you're using different approach, but as for me, if we have an infrastructure for testing, we should use it. And in Java, we have quite a good thing for testing, which is Java validation. Java validation allows us to test our values against many different things. For example, I can put annotation like not empty on top of, I can put constraints on top of my fields, I can put patterns on top of my fields in order to make sure that all these values are following it. So what's wrong? Pattern, please work. Regex. So let's write the code which will test our validation, and let's use some Spring features which allows us to validate our requests and our even before they reach the controller. Let's write another test. Right? Create applicant should fail if email or last name not provided. Throwing an exception, and as you may see here, I have quite interesting test. It allows me to check whether one or another, right? It would be nice not to repeat the code of my test 20 times. It would be nice to make my test parameterized. That's why instead of writing simple test, what I'm gonna use parameterized test. And here in the parameterized test, I'm going to receive an applicant, which I'm going to say to my endpoint. I'm posting my object mapper write value string my applicant and expect status is bad request. Because my values, in case if my values are not correct, I should expect a bad request. It's obviously because it's a client-side error. Okay, so how should I provide parameters for my test method? I said that my method which provide parameters for my test is called parameters, and method should be static. It should return a stream or collection of argument, and this is name of my method. I said it will return stream, so let's return stream of some values. And my first argument is applicant. Should be built, and this will be applicant without anything. In second, there will be applicant without email, but with last name, person name, and this is last name. For all these cases, my test should fail. But surprisingly, it works. Oh, it isn't working. Why? Should not be part of complete URL because, oh my god, because I was mistaken here. It should be applicants and there should be content. This should be content. Yep. Repeating, go. Okay, it is not working, but a bit different exception. Media type not supported exception because I did not include content type. Content type, media type, application JSON. Let's send it again. Again, it works. Hooray! Why? Because I haven't saved. I still need to perform a lot of, let's say, infrastructure work for my test. I need to configure my mock applicant service, and when I'm saving any applicant, let's say then answer in this is my applicant application get argument 0 set applicant id 1 up. So as you may see, but again, still not failing in the way I want. Oh, it is failing with for with status exception because as you may see, it has been successfully created but should not. Well, what can I use in Spring in order to perform a validation of data I'm sending here? The easiest way is to put valid annotation. How will it work? In Spring, we have a lot of binpack processor, and one of them is method validation post processor. And what it does, it wraps our code with, it wraps our components with proxy, which checks all the arguments with @valid annotation. By default, not by default, but out of the box, it gracefully work on any REST controller. So if you in your REST controller, you have a, for example, request parameter, you can validate it using Java validation. In case if you'd like to have the same behavior, but for example, for service layer it is not available out of the box, but nevertheless, you can put @validated annotation on top of it. And as a result, bin validation for method parameters will be provided even for your, let's say, even for your service classes as well. I assume that right now we're almost done with this scenario, but I'd like to extend it a little. What I want to do is I'd like to include a body, something into the I want to include something into the body of my response and test the body as well. It is not mandatory to return somebody in the create endpoints. It is expected that our let's say create endpoints will return at least create header. But for my testing purposes and for demonstration purposes, I'd like to include it as well. And for example, if I'd like to test my body, let me switch to the test. I again can use Spring. In Spring MVC, we have a fantastic capability which allows us to check JSON body. JSON path, for example, applicant ID should be equal to applicant ID. Well, import from Hungary. So what I'm doing here, for example, let me do another JSON path expression in order to show it in it even better. Person name, last name equal to last name. This is my last name. This is string, right? And this should be string value of applicant ID. Here, this JSON path methods allow me to test a JSON body as well. As you may see, something went wrong, and it was expected to have 10, but value is 10 as string. Okay, so applicant ID has failed. Expected string. Okay, this number. Right. Work. Okay, simple but quite powerful tool for testing of our REST controllers. Expected 10L, but okay. And I think at least for our demonstration purposes, that's okay. Okay, it works. So let's move forward, and please do not forget to put comments to the chat. Let me briefly remind what we've written. We've written a simple test for our REST controller. In our REST controller, we performed arrange bit. It is here. Next, we performed act and assert. What else we learned? We learned that we can use mock MVC for testing response status. We can use mock MVC for testing headers. We can use mock MVC for testing JSON body in the response. Also, what we learned is that Mockit is actually quite powerful, and besides ordinary mocking, we can use mocking with answers, not only mocking with with some returns, but what else we can do is that we can verify invocations and capture arguments which were, for example, passed to our mocks. And what else we learned is that SRJ is a bit more powerful in some situations. It's quite useful, and it's a bit more powerful than a standard assert library in JUnit. What else we learned? We learned that we can use parameterized test from JUnit, and it's good for testing, let's say, repeatable arguments. For example, we need to perform one test against many things. Well, I see comments from Artyom and Alex that my test method is complex, and you're right, because for my demonstration purposes, I wrote a few. I demonstrated here a lot of things, and you're absolutely right. For the best readability, it would be nice to split it into bits and pieces. That's a very good catch. If it's possible to give you high five, I'm giving you high five. Alex, thank you very much and Artyom, thank you very much for noticing it. But for my testing purposes, for demonstration purposes, I'm doing it in a way I'm doing it now, because I'm demonstrating different approaches, I'm demonstrating different use cases. So, thank you. Let's move forward. And let's write second. High five. Let's write a second layer of my application. What is the second layer of my application? It is service layer. For the service layer, before moving forward, as you may see, I have a lot of other scenarios in my application. Unfortunately, I do not have enough time to write all of them. If you open my GitHub repository, you will see that for all of these scenarios, there are test cases. So what I'm going to do next, I want to focus on a few more interesting scenarios. And maybe we will have time to write maybe 2 or 3 tests till the end, because only 14 minutes left. What I'm going to write next is to write an unhappy pass scenario, which says, in case if applicant is known to bank, it means that applicant can be found by email. There should be a 409 response code. Okay, if I start writing this test scenario from controller again, what I will do, I will configure my applicant service to work in different way. For example, it should throw an exception like applicant exist exception, and I'm going to add an assert which checks that status is 409. 409 status is conflict. Well, we already know how to do that. Let's move to the service layer and write implementation for my service as well, this test, of course. So what I'm going to do in my test, for testing, in case if I'd like to test my web controller, Spring need to create many beans, right? It need to create JSON mapper, it needs to create controller, it needs to create view resolver, it needs to create the register all the JSON mapping component and so on, many things. But service layer is quite isolated for me, right? Because it requires because I'm testing one single class in the box. And here, instead of using Spring test layer, I'm going to configure my JUnit test on my own. In order to do that, what I'm gonna do is to extend my test with Spring extension. And the next step for me is to put context configuration on top of it. As you know, Spring is nothing but a dependency injection container, and or invention of control container. And in order to provide me with dependency, Spring should be aware what dependencies are in my application context. And even for test, I should say, dear Spring, please include a class into my test application context. For example, I'm going to test applicant service, and in this case, it will be real applicant service in my application context. And next, what I can do, I can wire my application service unit under test into my test code. This is test, check, context, starts. I like to start with it. UUT is unit under test, and I'm adding assertions. Is not null. Why it is useful? Because it at least helped me to understand whether I included all the necessary classes into my application context. And by the way, in Spring, instead of putting two annotations, I can put only one. I can Spring JUnit config. I can put one single annotation instead of two. It will also work. But I don't know why there is no support of this annotation in IntelliJ. It says that my unit under test is not working as expected. Okay, so let's move forward. Let's implement this unhappy pass when applicant is known to bank, exception should be thrown, right? Right. What I'm going to write in my test, save, should throw exception when applicant is known to bank. I need to have a way to check that exception of particular type was thrown. So that's using assert.j, I'm writing the code like this. Assert that's thrown by, and this is code which should throw an exception. UUT, save, something. I need to configure applicant. I need to create an applicant again. I'm creating an applicant. When this applicant is saved, then my exception is instance of applicant exists exception dot class. This is the way to assert exceptions in assert.j. Let me create an exception. This is my exception. Let me do it extend runtime exception. Let me run the test again. And as you may see, it will fail. because exception was not thrown. But nevertheless, my application context starts, and as you may see, it starts much quicker. And as you may see, it complains that actually it was expected to have an applicant exist exception, but unsupported operation exception was thrown. Let's fix it a little. Of course, I have from getting back to my diagram, it is obvious that service layer will use data access layer. In order not to reinvent the wheel for data access layer, I'm gonna use applicant repository, and it will be this repository for now, but we all know that repositories in Spring are ordinarily something like a JPE repository or CRUD repositories, right? This is applicant and long is primary key. This is my repository. So why are you complaining? What's up? Change extension to implement. Oh, fantastic. It's interface. Yeah, and now I can configure this repository in my test as well. So instead of, I still do not have a real repository in my code, and I'm injecting it as a mock repository for shorting. Here it throws an exception. Work? No, it doesn't work. Why it is not working? Because I need to configure my repository, saying that when my repository, there should be some method in my repository, for example, find by email, and email is only equal to test@test.com, and only in this case you should return optional of some applicants. Builder builds, build. So I've added a few things. So here I'm saying that there should be methods which will return optional of applicant by email, right? And here what I need to do is still need to provide, still need to write a code. What will code will do? It will go to applicant repository, try to get by email. Let's say I have an optional of applicant. From applicant, I'm going to take applicant get person get person name. From person I need to take. Not person, of course. Applicant get contact point. From contact point, I need to get electronic address. From electronic address, I need to get an email. From and if not available, should throw an exception. And this is my applicant by email. And if my applicant by email is present, then I need to throw applicant exist exception. And if everything is okay and it does not exist, I'm calling applicant long, right? So I'm getting applicant by email, and it should work. So why it is not working? Because in my applicant here, I have not provided contact point. Electronic address and electronic address builder. And there is another trick I want to show to you. So if I put valid test.com here, my test should finally pass, right? But as you may see, in previous examples, what I used any. For example, any string. Any string is a quite wide matcher, right? If I'd like to have a more specific configuration of my mock, if I'd like to have a more specific configuration of my mock, I would use something like ick. And ick will work only in case if value is the same. As you may see here, I'm putting test1 instead of just test. That's why this mock is not working anymore. So it allows me to have more specific mocks. If I'm removing, my mock starting to work. Okay, everything seems to be working. And actually, this is everything I wanted to show you in for testing, let's say, service layer. As you may see, it is relatively simple. Again, my test is still following the same approach. Here I'm arranging it, I am acting and asserting. Of course, here we can implement the happy path scenarios as well. We can use DSL, that's a very good suggestion from Artem, but what are our main outcomes of this bit is we can use annotations provided by Spring. It's not bad, not good. We just have these annotations. And what else is that we can use more specific capture matchers for Makita. And what else is that assert that thrown by is quite a good thing. By the way, what we can do here, we can make some assertions not against our code, not only against our code, but also against the exception. Because, well, as you may see here, I'm asserting my exception that this exception is of a particular type, but also it's I can check the message of my exception here. For example, applicant exists, already exists. So it allows me to check my exception that it has a proper message inside. As you may see here, it is not working because I have not added a proper constructor. That's and I have not added a proper message here. Applicant already exists. Yes. Exists. Come on. I'm not going to replace anything. And speaking about ICRJ, I can customize. Oops, proper test. This one. I can customize the error message, which will be shown in case if my assertion fails. This fail message invalid exception. Let me make my code failing. Demonstrate it. As you may see, I'm customizing the error for my exception, for my assertion. For example, if you have many assertions in one, let's say in one test, it's not always good, but sometimes it happens. Let's be fair, it happens sometimes, and if you'd like to get a clear error message or you'd like to make it more readable, you can use this fail message. Okay, so our application should work now. We implemented almost everything we wanted except one thing. We already have our service, we have controller, we have repository, and the main question, are we sure that this repository is working as expected? To be honest, I'm not really sure that this repository is working as expected, but well, IntelliJ, of course, helps me and says that looks like I do not have email field in my applicant, but is there any way to test it? Is there any way to, let's say, to check that my methods in my repository is called correctly? And by the way, there is a way to do it. So we can write tests for repositories as well. And here we're gonna use another testing layer from Spring. This testing layer is provided by JPA, data JPA test annotation. And if you take a look into this annotation, we again will see that this is meta annotation. It configures a lot of things for us. But nevertheless, what it allows us to test, it allows us to test our repository. So let me test my repository, inject my repository into the test. This is my repository. And what I'm going to start with, I'm going to start with check context starts and my favorite assertion is not null. Let's run this test. Okay, it fails, but why does it fail? Because it fails to start, because it says, well, in applicant there is no property email. We can have let's say many ways to fix it. What we can do is to say find by applicant name or person, no, or maybe electronic address. No, it is very nested field. Of course we can write method for Spring data, which will be very long, but at the same time not readable. This is the one single option. Yes, as you may see, even IntelliJ helps me to write a proper method, but nevertheless, email is very deeply nested into my domain object. That's why I'm gonna use a bit different way. I'm still saying that please find by email, but instead of relying on Spring Data JPA, I will say this is the query I want to use for finding my applicant. And if you don't mind, I will take a look into my helper. I have a helper here in order to write this query properly from applicant A, where applicant dot contact point dot electronic address dot email is equal to 1. So this is the query, and this is a real and a working query. And at this moment, my application will start and will work. Okay, it starts. At least my context starts. It means that actually Spring Data JP managed to create an instance of this repository, and it managed to create this query. But how can I be sure that this test can be actually executed? This query can be actually executed. And of course, there is a way I can use tests for doing that. But in order to get a record from database, I need to put it into the database, right? And here Spring provides me with a quite useful test component, which is called test entity manager. You know, if you're using JPA, under the hood we have entity manager, right? We have persistent unit. If we're using Spring, first of all, the first thing we have, the first abstraction we have entity manager, and inside entity manager we have persistence unit and all that stuff. For testing purposes, we have test entity manager, and the main benefit of test entity manager that actually it allows us to interact with underlying in-memory database. So what does it mean? I can create a new applicant, builder builds. Well, it's a little annoying, to be honest, to create applicants because they are really big. And as it was noticed in the chat, it would be nice to have a helper method, applicant to save. And this is my entity manager. In my entity manager, I'm persisting and flush on my applicant. And what I'm going to do next, I'm going to find my applicant by email. Email is known to me. This is from database. And I'm asserting that from database is present. So it means that records from database can be extracted. Hooray or not? Not hooray. Why? Validation, because applicant person, I need to provide a person and person name as well. So the main model create a lot of I cannot save. Hooray, it works. What are the main benefits of using this approach? If we're using data JDBC, we're assuming that actually, okay, so you may say that I haven't checked data, I haven't checked other fields, but you know, I can do it using equal to applicant to save, excluding, ignoring field, applicant ID. I haven't checked that record I saved is the same as the record I received. Well, if the main benefit and main drawback of using this approach is that we're using Spring Data JDBC. Spring Data JPA. JPA says that despite the database we're using, our queries should work in the similar way. Nevertheless, in some cases it doesn't work, or we may use some database-specific features. So this approach works very good when we use when this approach works very good when we use simple database like MySQL, for example, or H2, but with big databases like Oracle or Postgres with very specific custom configuration, it may not work. That's why what we can do for this kind of testing, we can use test containers. I don't think we have a lot of time for writing tests for test containers. That's requires, I suppose, a separate session. But nevertheless, using Spring Data JPE, we can use test containers as well. The main complexity here is that we need to provide Spring with a connection string to the database started in test container. And let me briefly show one trick which allows us to intercept the process of creation of application context for tests, and the way we can include our own environment variables in the test. What we can do, dynamic, come on. We can register a dynamic property source. It will be a static method, public static property source. And here will be registry. I forget the name of dynamic property registry. This is registry, and this registry allows us to register some parameters. For example, Spring data JDB JPA URL, and here will be the URL of database we're starting in test container, because this is actually the main complication of using Spring with test containers. We need to make sure that Spring aware where, for example, our database is started. Dynamic property source allows us to solve this complexity. I will comment it for now, and well, to be honest, at this moment we have almost all the application written, but we, of course, have not had the chance to write all the bits together. That's why even if I start my application, not all the tests will pass. I'm starting my application, I'm getting back to my E2E tests, I'm running it. Let me start my E2E tests, and you will see that not all of them will pass. Majority of them will fail, but strangely, why? To be honest, I do not want to debug it right now. Why they are not starting? I will just switch to the proper branch, to the branch where all my code is written. So in order to do it, unfortunately, I have to remove all the code I've written right now. Git checkouts main, and pull in all my code. And I'm starting my application. And now all the tests will finally pass against my application. But let's check. Okay, all my tests, all my acceptance tests, which were written using Gherkin, are finally passing. Everything works, my application is working, and everybody is happy. But as you may notice, in order to run these tests, I need to do a few manual steps. I need to start my application and I need to run my tests, right? Right. But on the other hand, what we have, by the way, Docker. And Docker allows us to significantly simplify this process. And what I'm going to do right now, I'm going to, well, let me open the terminal. I think it will be much easier to show. Or maybe not terminal. Let me check. So this is my big terminal. CD Linux TDD. Yeah. So I will make it bigger. If I run my Maven script, let's say not Maven script, but my Maven clean verify, what will happen under the hood? Under the hood, Maven will build my application. Next, as soon as application is built, it will start building my E2E tests, right? Right. But how will E2E tests run the application which live in a separate module? The easiest way to do it is to build a Docker image from my application. And by the way, there are many ways of building Docker images, but due to the fact that we're using Spring, we can ask Spring to build a Docker image for us. In order to do that, for my Spring Boot Maven plugin, I need to add an execution with this goal, build image. This build image goal will use build pack to build an image for my Spring Boot application, and this image will be, by the way, quite optimized for running Spring Boot application because, well, what's the point? You know that Docker is actually building images in layers. And basic layer is something like a tiny Linux image. Next layer is our JDK. And third layer is our, by the way, let me run it and show. And the next layer is something like our big fat jar. If we're building a Docker image using Spring Boot's Maven plugin, it will be built in a bit different way. By the way, I already have a built image. It is here. Let's take a look into the built image, which is built by Spring Boot Maven plugin. Spring Boot Gradle plugin builds the same image. So this is a bit of 9-bit. So think. Bear with me for a moment. Okay, so just bear with me for a moment. Something is not working as expected. Why? Because I want to press Command Shift L, but it is not working today. Okay. is, well, I need to press a button, but it is, I don't know why I can do that. Maybe I'm on the wrong, maybe I am on wrong. Oh, finally, tick, tick. Bear with me for a moment. Something is not definitely good. I still want to show it to you. Oh. Finally, a moment. Oh. Yep. So this is the Docker image which is built by Maven plugin. It is, as you may see, on the left-hand side is layer, on the right-hand side is what was added to the layer. So as you may see, it is built from quite not very tiny 63 megabytes Linux. Next, it adds some infrastructure for running application. It is Linux things. Next, it adds some files from build pack like certificates. Next, it adds some configuration for it adds Java and configuration of it, and JRE class path and so on. But what is interesting here we're starting, it starts adding Spring build pieces of Spring Boot application. So first of all, it adds cloud bindings. It is a set of components, let's say set of configuration for running Spring Cloud. Next, it adds a jar force cloud binding. Next, it adds JSON Swiss configuration. Next, it add, and this is an interesting bit. What is added next? Next, actually, it adds all the dependencies I have in my application. Why and what is next? Next, it adds another set of dependencies. It is Spring Loader, and only after that it adds it adds classes of which were written by me. What's the difference and why it is important? The idea is that we will build our Docker images quicker if we will reuse some layers of our Docker images. And the point is that this set of libraries, for example, provided by Spring, are changed very rarely because we're not so often change our dependencies. But this bit, which is written by us personally, this bit, let's say this 41 kilobyte is it will be changed much more often. That's why it would be nice to put them on top of our Docker image. That's why all these layers will be reused and only this layer will be created. It allows to build our images quicker. And this feature is provided not only by Spring Boot Maven plugin, but also it's quite an interesting feature of Spring jar because it is layered. Okay, what I see here, 5 minutes left. My first step in my build pipeline was to build a Docker image, and at the end of the day, my Docker image was built and successfully published to my local Docker registry. It is available. Next step is that before running my end-to-end tests, I need to spin up a Docker container with the image I built on the previous step. What should I do in order to do that? Well, I have already shown you dependencies of the second POM. As you may see, there is nothing interesting. It's just Spring Boot Starter, and I added it just for convenience of writing my tests. But if I take a look into my plugins, you will see that it has a bit tricky configuration. Just because it is Maven. For Gradle, it would be a little simpler, but nevertheless, approach is the same. So, first of all, if you take a look into my test, you will notice that actually it is not a test, it is ended with IT, integration test. And in Maven, we know that integration tests are executed by file fail-safe plugin. And fail-safe plugin actually brings us a few additional phases into our pipeline. It allows us to have pre-integration tests and post-integration test phases. And what else I'm doing? I'm going to use Fabricate plugin. It is Docker Maven plugin provided by Fabricate, and in pre-integration test, it will spin up my Docker container, and post-integration test, after executing them, it will stop my Docker container. And here I'm saying what is the name of my container, what is the image to be used, port mapping, and some waiters before running my before moving forward, before running my test. Here, as you may see, I'm mapping port 88 from container to port 82 of my computer, and I'm waiting for actuator to say that everything is ready. We'll wait for 30 seconds. Of course, it's possible to use Maven helper plugin to have a random port. And this is actually a way to integrate your end-to-end test into your build pipeline. So let's wrap up. What's left? What's our main outcomes? This is actually the application we've written. And as you will see, our application is a layered application. It has 3 layers. We tested all of them, not simultaneously, but one by one. We've written this is, let's say, a sequence diagram. This sequence diagram might be quite helpful in writing the implementation. This is what we actually written. This is our domain model, which I used. And here in comments, as you may see, validations are declared. And this is a service layer, which I'm going to use. And this is my REST endpoints. We implemented all of them. This is way of testing of our application with Docker, and also I shortly shown integration of Docker with Maven, and that's all. So what we learned today? The tests are actually a very good way of documenting behavior and writing specifications for our application. Next main outcome is that please be familiar with tools you're using. You're using Spring for writing your application. Don't forget to be aware of Spring for testing your application, because Spring is a fantastic framework. It allows not only write, but also test your code. All the examples I've shown today are available on GitHub. So please follow me on GitHub, on Twitter, and like, share. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexander. It was a great session, and please don't forget to follow us in Telegram and on YouTube. So I have just one question. Do you have any suggestions when we shouldn't use TDD and shouldn't write tests?
Well, it's a very provocatory question, right? I know. But I know the answer, to be honest. For example, in case if you write a tool which you're going to run only once, for example, to calculate, I don't know, to calculate something, and you will get rid of this code right after that, so you may not write test. But if you know that your test will be executed, your code will live longer than 1 day, you should definitely write tests. I think it's a, let's say, a trade-off. If you're writing your code, running your code only once, and next you're getting rid of it, well, you may not write tests. If you're writing your code and it will be maintained, it will be used in production, it's better having tests.
Thank you. Thank you for the session. I think that's it for today. Thank you, everyone who were on the session. See you next time.
Thank you very much. It was really pleasant for me to be here. Andrei and Codebrick Club, thank you very much for having me today. I wish you all good luck.
Bye.
Bye.